A Dancing Fire, Chapter 4, by Wagging Yard. 18 Boss Mary and one Citadelic former senior clerk from an Imperial Building Commission trudged through the jungle westward from the Silo River to the ancient village of Indisi. For Decumus Scotty, the jungle was hostile, unfamiliar ground. The enormous vermiculated trees filled the bright morning with darkness, and resembled nothing so much as grasping claws, bent on impeding their progress. Even the fronds of the low plants quivered with malevolent energy. What was worse, he was not alone in his anxiety. His fellow travelers, the natives who had survived the Kashid attacks on the village of Grenos and Athe, wore faces of undisguised fear. There was something sentient in the jungle, and not merely the mad but malevolent indigenous spirits. In his peripheral vision, Scotty could see the shadows of the Kashiti following the refugees, leaping from tree to tree. When he turned to face them, the lithe forms vanished into the gloom as if they had never been there. But he knew he had seen them, and the Boss Mary saw them too, and quickened their pace. After 18 hours, beaten raw by insects, scratched by 1,000 thorns, they emerged into a valley clearing. It was night, but a row of blazing torches greeted them, illuminating the leather-wrought tents and jumbled stones of the hamlet of Bindisi. At the end of the valley, the torches marked a sacred site, a gnarled bower of trees pressed close together to form a temple. Wordlessly, the Boss Mary walked to the torch arcade towards the trees. Scotty followed them. When they reached the solid mass of living wood with only one gaping portal, Scotty could see a dim blue light glowing within. A low sonorous moan from 100 voices echoed within. The Boss Mary maiden he had been following held out her hand, stopping him. "You do not understand, but no outsider, not even a friend, may enter," she said. "This is a holy place." Scotty nodded and watched the refugees march into the temple, heads bowed. Their voices joined with the ones within. When the last wood elf had gone inside, Scotty turned his attention back to the village. There must be food to be had somewhere. A trundle of smoke and a faint whiff of roasting venison beyond the torchlight led him. They were 5 Cyrodiils, 2 Bretons, and a Nord. The group gathered around a campfire of glowing white stones, pulling steaming strips of meat from the cadaver of a great stag. At Scotty's approach, they rose up, all but the Nord, who was distracted by his hunk of animal flesh. "Good evening, sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering if I may have a little something to eat. I'm afraid I'm rather hungry after walking all day with some refugees from Grenos and Athe." They bade him to sit down and eat, and introduced themselves. "So the war's back on, it seems," said Scotty amiably. "Best thing for these effete do-nothings," replied the Nord in between bites. "I've never seen such a lazy culture. Now they got the Kashiti striking them on land, and the High Elves at sea. If there's any province that deserves a little distress, it's damnable Valenwood." "I don't see how they are so offensive to you," laughed one of the Bretons. "They are congenital thieves, even worse than the Kashiti, because they are so blessed meek in their aggression." The North spat out a gulp of fat, which sizzled on the hot stones of the fire. They spread their forests into territory that doesn't belong to them, slowly infiltrating their neighbors, and they are puzzled when elsewhere shoves back at them. They are all villains on the worst order of the worst order. They are all villains of the worst order. "What are you doing here?" asked Scotty. "I am a diplomat from the court of Gehenna," muttered the Nord, returning to his food. "What about you? What are you doing here?" asked one of the Cyrodiils. "I work for Lord Atreus' Building Commission in the Imperial City," said Scotty. "One of my former colleagues suggested that I come down to Valenwood. He said the war was over and I could contract a great deal of business from my firm rebuilding what was lost. One disaster after another, and I have lost all my money. I'm in the middle of a rekindling of war, and I cannot find my former colleague." "Your former colleague," murmured another of the Cyrodiils, who had introduced himself as Reglius. "He wasn't by any chance named Leodes Shurus, was he?" You know him? He lured me down to Balenwood in nearly the exact same circumstances, replied Reglius firmly. I worked for your employer's competitor, Lord Vanek's man, where Leodes Shurus also formerly worked. He wrote to me asking that I represent an Imperial Building Commission and contact some post-war construction. I had just been released from my employment, and I thought that if I brought some new business, I could have my job back. Shurus and I met in Athe, and he said he was going to arrange a very lucrative meeting with the Sylvanar. Scotty was stunned. Where is he now? I'm no theologian, so I couldn't say. Reglius shrugged. He's dead. When the Kashiti attacked Athe, they began by torching the harbor where Shurus was ready in his boat. Or I should say my boat, since it was purchased with the gold I brought. By the time we were even aware of what was happening enough to flee, everything by the water was ash. The Kashiti may be animals, but they know how to arrange an attack. I think they followed us through the jungle to Bindisi, said Scotty nervously. There was definitely a group of something jumping along the treetops. Probably one of the monkey folk, snorted the North. Nothing to be concerned about. When we first came to Bindisi and the boss Mary all entered that tree, they were furious, whispering something about unleashing an ancient terror on their enemies. The Breton shivered, remembering. They have been there ever since, for over a day and a half now. If you want something to be afraid of, that's the direction to look. The other Breton, who was a representative of the Daggerfall Mages Guild, was staring off into the darkness while his fellow provincial spoke. Maybe, but there's something in the jungle too, right on the edge of the village, looking in. More refugees, maybe? Asked Scotty, trying to keep the alarm out of his voice. Not unless they are traveling through the trees now, whispered the wizard. The North and one of the Cyrodiils grabbed a long tarp of wet leather and pulled it across the fire, instantly extinguishing it without so much as a sizzle. Now Scotty could see the intruders, their elliptical yellow eyes and long cruel blades catching the torchlight. He froze with fear, praying that he too was not so visible to them. He felt something bump against his back and gasped. Reglius' voice hissed from above. Be quiet for Mara's sake and climb up here. Scotty grabbed hold of the knotted double vine that hung down from a tall tree at the edge of the dead campfire. He scrambled it up as quickly as he could, holding his breath lest any grunt of exertion escape him. At the top of the vine, high above the village, was an abandoned nest from some great bird in a trident-shaped branch. As soon as Scotty had pulled himself into the soft, fragrant straw, Reglius pulled up the vine. No one else was there, and when Scotty looked down, he could see no one below. No one. That is except the Kashiti, slowly moving towards the glow of the temple tree. Thank you, whispered Scotty, deeply touched that a competitor had helped him. He turned away from the village and saw that the tree's upper branches brushed against the mossy rock walls that surrounded the valley below. How are you at climbing? You're mad, said Reglius. You're mad, said Reglius under his breath. We should stay here until they leave. If they weren't been dizzy like they did Athe and Grenos, we'd be dead, sure as we were on the ground. Scotty began the slow, careful climb up the tree, testing each branch. Can you see what they are doing? I can't really tell. Reglius stared down into the gloom. They are at the front of the temple. I think they also have... It looks like long ropes trailing off behind them, off into the pass. Scotty crawled onto the strongest branch and pointed towards the wet, rocky face of the cliff. It was not a far jump at all, so close, in fact, that he could smell the moisture, feel the coolness of the stone. But it was a jump, nevertheless, and in his history as a clerk, he had never before leapt from a tree 100 feet off the ground to a sheer rock. He pictured in his mind's eye the shadows that had pursued him through the jungle, from the heights above, how their legs coiled to spring, how their arms snapped forward in an elegant fluid motion to grasp. He leapt. His hands grabbed the rock, but long thick cords of moss were more accessible. He held hard, but when he tried to plant his feet forward, they slipped up skyward. For a few seconds he found himself upside down before he managed to pull himself onto a more conventional position. There was a narrow outcropping jutting out of the cliff where he would stand and finally exhale. Regulus, Regulus, Regulus. Scotty did not dare to call out. In a minute there was a shaking of branches, and Lord Vannick's man emerged. First his satchel, and then his head, then the rest of him. Scotty started to whisper something, but Regulus shook his head and violently pointed downward. One of the Hashiti was at the base of the tree, peering at the remains of the campfire. Regulus awkwardly tried to balance himself onto the branch, but as strong as it was exceedingly difficult with only one free hand. Scotty cupped his palms and then pointed at the satchel. It seemed to pain Regulus to let it out of his grasp, but he relented and tossed it to Scotty. There was a small, almost invisible hole in the bag, and when Scotty caught it, a single gold coin dropped out. It rang as it bounced against the rock wall on the descent. A high, soft sound that seemed like the loudest alarm Scotty had ever heard. Then many things happened very quickly. The Cathay rat at the base of the tree looked up and gave a loud wail. The other Kashiti followed in chorus, as the cat below crouched down and then sprung into the lower branches. Regulus saw it below him, climbing up with impossible dexterity, and panicked. Even before he jumped, Scotty could tell that he was going to fall. With a cry, Regulus the clerk plunged to the ground, breaking his neck on impact. A flash of white fire erupted from every crevice of the temple, and the moan of the Boss Mary prayer changed into something terrible and otherworldly. The climbing Cathay rat stopped and stared. Keirgo, it gasped, the wild hunt. It was as if a crack in reality had opened wide. A flood of horrific beasts, tentacled toads, insects of armor and spine, gelatinous serpents, vaporous beings with the face of gods, all poured forth from the great hollow tree. Blind with fury, they tore the Kashiti in front of the temple to pieces. All the other cats fled for the jungle, but as they did so, they began pulling on the ropes they carried. In a few seconds' time, the entire village of Indisi was boiling with the lunatic apparitions of the wild hunt. Over the babbling, barking, howling horde, Scotty heard the Girardeos in hiding cry out as they were devoured. The North, too, was found uneaten, and both Bretons, the wizard, had turned himself invisible, but the swarm did not rely on their sight. The tree the Cathay rat was in began to sway and rock from the impossible violence beneath it. Scotty looked at the Kashiti's fear-struck eyes and held out one of the cords of moss. The cat's face showed its peaceful gratitude as it leapt from the vine. It didn't have time to entirely replace that expression when Scotty pulled back the cord and watched it fall. The hunt consumed it to the bone before it struck the ground. Scotty's own jump up to the next outcropping of rock was immeasurably more successful. From there he pulled himself to the top of the cliff and was able to look down into the chaos that had been the village of Indisi. The hunt's mass had grown and began to spill out. Through the pass, out of the valley, pursuing the fleeing Kashiti. It was then that the madness truly began. In the moonlight, from Scotty's vantage, he could see where the Kashiti had attached their ropes. With a thunderous boom, an avalanche of boulders poured over the pass. When the dust cleared, he saw that the valley had been sealed. The wild hunt had nowhere to turn but on itself. Scotty turned his head, unable to bear to look at the cannibalistic orgy. The night jungle stood before him, a web of wood. He slung Regulus' satchel over his shoulder and entered. A Dancing Fire, Chapter 5, by Wagging Yarth. Soap! The forest will eat love. Straight ahead, stupid cow. The voice boomed out so suddenly that Scotty jumped. He stared off into the dim jungle glade from which he only heard animal and insect calls, and the low whistling of wind moments before. It was a queer, oddly accented voice of indiscriminate gender, tremulous in its modulations but unmistakably human, or at the very least, elven. An isolated Bosmer, perhaps, with a poor grasp of the Cyrodiilic language. After countless hours of plodding through the dense knot of Wallenwood jungle, any voice of slight familiarity sounded wondrous. "Hello?" he cried. "Beetles on any names? Certainly yesterday, yes." The voice called back. "Who, what, and when, and mice?" "I am afraid I don't understand," replied Scotty, turning towards the bramble tree, because a wagon, where the voice had issued. "But you needn't be afraid of me. My name is Deacon Scotty. I'm a Cyrodiil from the Imperial City. I came here to help rebuild Valenwood after the war, you see, and now I'm rather lost." "Gemstones and grilled slaves. The war," moaned the voice and broke down into sobs. "You know about the war? I wasn't sure. I wasn't even sure how far away from the border I am now." Scotty began slowly walking towards the tree. He dropped Regulus' satchel to the ground and held out his empty hands. "I'm unarmed. I only want to know the way to the closest town. I'm trying to meet my friend, Leo the Shurus, in Sylvanar." "Sylvanar!" the voice laughed. It laughed even louder as Scotty circled the tree. "Worms and wine, worms and wine. Sylvanar sings from worms and wine." There was nothing to be found anywhere around the tree. "I don't see you. Why are you hiding?" In frustration, born of hunger and exhaustion, he struck the tree trunk. A sudden shiver of gold and red erupted from the hollow nook above, and Scotty was surrounded by 6 winged creatures, scarcely more than a few inches long. Bright crimson eyes were set on either side of the tunnel-like protuberances, the animals' always open mouth. They were legless, and their thin, rapidly beating, aureate wings seemed poorly constructed to transport their fat, swollen bellies. And yet they darted through the air like sparks from a fire. Whirling about the poor clerk, they began chattering, what he now understood to be perfect nonsense. "Wines and worms, how far from the border am I? Academic garnishments, and alas, Leo the Shurus. Hello, I'm afraid I'm unarmed? Smoke and flames, and the closest town is dear Oblivion. Swollen and bad meat, and indigo nimbus. But you needn't be afraid of me. Why are you hiding? What are you hiding? Before I begin to befriend, love me. Lady Zuleika." Furious with the mimics, Scotty swung his arms, driving them up into the treetops. He stumped back to the clearing and opened up the satchel again, as he had done same hours before. There was still, surprisingly, nothing useful in the bag, and nothing to eat in any corner of pocket. A goodly amount of gold, he smiled grimly, as he had done before, at the irony of being financially solvent in the jungle. A stack of neat blank contracts from Lord Bannock's building commission, some thin cord, and an oil leather cloak for bad weather. At least, Scotty considered, he had not suffered rain. A rolling moan of thunder reminded Scotty of what he had suspected for some weeks now. He was cursed. Within an hour's time, he was wearing the cloak and clawing his way through the mud. The trees, which had earlier allowed no sunlight in, provided no shelter against the pouring storm and wind. The only sounds that pierced the pelting of the rain were the mocking calls of the flying creatures, fleeting just above, babbling their nonsense. Scotty bellowed at them through rocks, but they seemed enamored of his company. While he was reaching to grab a promising-looking stone to hurl at his tormentors, Scotty felt something shift beneath his feet. Wet but solid ground suddenly liquefied and became a rolling tide, rushing him forward. Light as a leaf, he flew head over feet overhead. Light as a leaf, he flew head over feet overhead until the mudflow dropped and he continued forward, plunging down into the river 25 feet below. The storm passed quite as instantly as he had arrived. The sun melted the dark clouds and warmed Scotty as he swam from the shore. There, another sign of the Kashiti incursion into Valenwood greeted him. A small fishing village had stood there once, so recently extinct that it smoldered like a still warm corpse. Dirt cairns that had once housed fish by the smell of them had been ravished, their bounty turned to ash. Rafts and skiff lay broken, scuttled, half submerged. All the villagers were no more, either dead or refugees far away, or so he presumed. Something banged against the wall of one of the ruins. Scotty ran to investigate. "My name is Decuma Scotty," sang the first winged beast. "I'm at Cyrodiil from the Imperial City. I came here to help rebuild Valenwood after the war, you see, and now I'm rather lost." "I swelled to maculate Upneck," agreed one of its companions. "I don't see you. What are you hiding?" As they fell into chattering, Scotty began to search the rest of the village. Surely the cats had left something behind, a scrap of dried meat, a morsel of fish, sausage, anything. But they had been immaculate in their complete annihilation. There was nothing to eat anywhere. Scotty did find one item of possible use under the tumbled remains of a stone hut. A bow and 2 arrows made of bone. The string had been lost, likely burned away in the heat of the fire, but he pulled the cord from Regulus' satchel and restrung it. The creatures flew over and hovered nearby as he worked, convent of the sacred Leodes Juras. "You know about the war? Words and wine. Circumscribe a golden host. Ape-neck." The moment the cord was taut, Scotty knocked an arrow and swung around, pulling the string tight against his chest. The winged beasts, having had experience with archers before, shooed off in all directions in a blur. They needn't have bothered. Scotty's first arrow dove into the ground 3 feet in front of him. He swore and retreated. The mimics, having likewise had experience with poor archers before, returned at once to hovering nearby and mocking Scotty. On his second shot, Scotty did much better in purely technical terms. He remembered how the archers in Falinesti looked when he pulled himself out of under the Hoarder's stick, and they would all taking aim at him. He extended his left hand, and right elbow in symmetrical line, drawing the bow so his hand touched his jawline, and he could see the creature in his side like the arrow was a finger he was pointing with. The bolt missed the target by only 2 feet, but it continued on its trajectory, snapping when it struck a rock wall. Scotty walked to the river's edge. He had only 1 arrow left, and perhaps he considered it would be most practical to find a slow-moving fish and fire it on that. If he missed, at least there was less of a chance of breaking the shaft, and he could always retrieve it from the water. A rather torpid, whiskered fish, well guarded, and he took aim at it. "My name is Decuma Scotty," one of the creatures howled, frightening the fish away. "Stupid and a stupid cow. Will you dance a dance in fire?" Scotty turned and aimed the arrow as he had done before. This time, however, he remembered to plant his feet as the archers had done, 7 inches apart, knees straight, left leg slightly forward to meet the angle of his right shoulder. He released the last arrow. The arrow also proved a serviceable prong for roasting the creature against the smoking hot stones of one of the ruins. Its other companions had disappeared instantly after the beast was slain, and Scotty was able to dine in peace. The meat proved to be delicious, if scarcely more than a first course. He was picking the last of it from the bones when a boat sailed into view from around the bend of the river. At the helm were Postmer sailors. Scotty ran to the bank and waved his arms. They averted their eyes and continued past. "You bloody callous bastards," Scotty howled. "Knaves, hooligans, ape-necks, scoundrels." A grey whiskered form came out from a hatch, and Scotty immediately recognized him as Griff Malone, the poet, translator he had met in the caravan from Cyrodiil. He peered Scotty's direction, and his eyes lit up with delight. "Decuma Scotty, precisely the man I hoped to see. I want to get your thoughts on a rather puzzling passage in the Monoriat Playbar. It begins, 'I went weeping into the world, searching for wonders.' Perhaps you're familiar with it." I would like nothing better than to discuss the Noriat play bar with you, Griff, Scotty called back. Will you let me come on board, though, first? I knew he was going to come back. I was hoping he was coming back. Oh, that's so good. Overjoyed at being on a ship bound for any port at all, Scotty was true to his word. For over an hour, as the boat rolled down the river past the blackened remnants of Boss Mary villages, he asked no questions and spoke nothing of his life over the past weeks. He merely listened to Malone's theories on Merethic Aldemary Esoterica. The translator was undemanding of his guest's scholarship, accepting nods and shrugs as civilized conversation. He even produced some wine and fish jelly, which he shared with Scotty absent-mindedly, as he expounded on his various theses. Finally, while Malone was searching for a reference to some minor point in his notes, Scotty asked, rather off subject, but I was wondering where we are bound. The very heart of the province, Sylvanar, Malone said, not looking up from the passage he was reading. It's somewhat bothersome, actually, as I wanted to go to Woodhearth first, to talk to a Bosmer there who claims to have an original copy of Dirith Yalmilheir, if you can believe it, but for the time being, that has to wait. Somerset Isle has surrounded the city, and it is in the process of starving the citizenry until they surrender. It is a tiresome prospect, since the Bosmeri are happy to eat one another, so there's a risk that at the end, only one fat wood elf will remain to have to wave the flag. That is vexing, agreed Scotty sympathetically. To the east, the Kashiti are burning everything, and to the west, the High Elves are waging war. I don't suppose the borders to the north are clear. They are even worse, replied Malone, finger on the page, still distracted. The Cyrodiils and Redguards don't want Bosmer refugees steaming into their provinces. It only stands to reason. Imagine how much more criminally inclined they would be now that they are homeless and hungry. So, murmured Scotty, feeling a shiver, we are trapped in Ballenwood. Not at all. I need to leave fairly shortly myself, as my publisher has set a very definite deadline for my new book of translations. From what I understand, one merely petitions to the Sylvanar for special border protection, and one can cross into Cyrodiil with impunity. Petition the Sylvanar or petition at Sylvanar? Petition the Sylvanar at Sylvanar. It's an odd nomenclature that is typical of this place, the sort of thing that makes my job as a translator that much more challenging. The Sylvanar, he, or rather, they, are the closest the Bosmeri have to a great leader. The essential thing to remember about the Sylvanar, Maron smiled, finding the passage he was looking for. Here, a fortnight inexplicable, the world burns into a dance. There's that metaphor again. What were you saying about the Sylvanar? Asked Scotty. The essential thing to remember? I don't remember what I was saying, replied Malone, turning back to his oration. In a week's time, the little boat bumped along the shallow, calmer waters of the foaming current the silo had become, and Decomus Scotty first saw the city of Sylvanar. If Valinesti was a tree, then Sylvanar was a flower, a magnificent pile of faded shades of green, red, blue, and white, shining with crystalline residue. Malone had mentioned offhand, not otherwise explaining Aldmeri prosody, that Sylvanar had once been a blossoming glade in the forest, but owing to some spell or natural cause, the tree's sap began flowing with translucent liquor. The process of the sap flowing and hardening over the colorful trees had formed the web of the city. Malone's description was intriguing, but it hardly prepared him from the city's beauty. What is the finest, most luxurious tavern here? Scotty asked one of the Bosmer boatmen. Rithala Hall, Malone answered. Why don't you stay with me? I'm visiting an acquaintance of mine, a scholar I think you will find fascinating. His hovel isn't much, but he has the most extraordinary ideas about the principles of a heretical married tribe, the smarthy. Under any other circumstances, I would happily accept, said Scotty graciously. But after weeks of sleeping on the ground or on a raft and eating whatever I could scrounge, I feel the need for some indulgent creature comforts. And then, after a day or two, I'll petition the Sylvanar for a safe passage to Cyrodiil. The men bade each other goodbye. Griff Ballon gave him the address of his publisher in the Imperial City, which Scotty accepted and quickly forgot. The clerk wandered the streets of Sylvanar, crossing bridges of amber, admiring the petrified forest architecture, in front of a particularly estimable palace of silvery reflective crystal. He found Virthala Hall. He took the finest room and ordered a gluttonous meal of the finest quality. At a nearby table he saw two very fat fellows, a man and a bosmer, remarking how much finer the food was there than at Sylvanar's palace. They began to discuss the war and some issues of finances and rebuilding provincial bridges. The man noticed Scotty looking at them, and his eyes flashed recognition. "Scotty, is that you? Kinareth, where have you been? I have had to make all the contacts here on my own." At the sound of his voice, Scotty recognized him. The fat man was Leodes Shurus, vastly engorged. The Dancing Fire, Chapter 6 by Wagen Yarth. Decamus Scotty sat down, listening to Leodes Shurus. The clerk could hardly believe how fat his former colleague at Lord Atreus' building commission had become. The piquant aroma of the roasted meat dish before Scotty melted away. All the other sounds and textures of Virthala Hall vanished all around him, as if nothing else existed but the vast form of Juros. Scotty did not consider himself an emotional man, but he felt a tide flow over him at the sight and sound of the man whose badly written letters had been the guideposts that carried him from the Imperial City back in early frostfall. "Where have you been?" Juros demanded again. "I told you to meet me in Falinesti weeks ago." "I was there weeks ago." Scotty stammered, too surprised to be indignant. "I got your note to meet you in Athe, and so I went there, but the Hashiti had burned it to the ground. Somehow I found my way with the refugees in another village, and someone there told me that you had been killed." "And you believed that away? And you believed that right away?" Juros sneered. "The fellow seemed very well informed about you. He was a clerk from Lord Bannock's building commission named Redlius, and he said that you had also suggested that he come down to Valenwood to profit from the war." "Oh, yes," said Juros after thinking a moment. "I recall the name now. Well, it's good for business to have two representatives from Imperial building commissions here. We just need to all coordinate our bids, and all should be well." "Recluse is dead," said Scotty, "but I have his contracts from Lord Bannock's commission." "Even better," gasped Juros, impressed. "I never knew you were such a ruthless competitor," echoed Scotty. "Yes, this could certainly improve our position with the Sylvanar. Have I introduced you to Bast here?" Scotty had only been dimly aware of the Bosmer's presence at the table with Juros, which was surprising given that the mare's grief nearly equaled his dining companion. The clerk nodded to Bast coldly, still numb and confused. It had not left his mind that only an hour earlier Scotty had intended to petition the Sylvanar for safe passage through the border back to Cyrodiil. The thought of doing business with Juros, after all, of profiting from Valenwood war with elsewhere, and now the second one with the Somerset Isle, seemed like something happening to another person. "Your colleague and I were talking about the Sylvanar," said Bast, putting down the leg of mutton he had been gnawing on. "I don't suppose you have heard about his nature." "A little, but nothing very specific. I got the impression that he's very important and very peculiar." "He's the representative of the people, legally, physically, and emotionally," explained Juros, a little annoyed at his new partner's lack of common knowledge. "When they are healthy, so is he. When they are mostly female, so is he. When they cry for food, or trade for an absence of foreign interference, he feels it too. and makes laws according in a way. He's a despot, but he's the people's despot. That sounds, said Scotty, searching for the appropriate word. Like bunk. Perhaps it is, shrugged Bast, but he has many rights as the voice of the people, including the granting of foreign building and trade contracts. It's not important whether you believe us. Just think of the Sylvanar as being like one of your mad emperors, like Pelagius. The problem facing us now is that since Valenwood is being attacked on all sides, the Sylvanar's aspect is now one of distrust and fear of foreigners. The one hope of his people, and thus of the Sylvanar himself, is that the Emperor will intervene and stop the war. Will he? Asked Scotty. You know as well as we do that the Emperor has not been himself lately. Shurus helped himself to Reglius' satchel and pulled out the blank contracts. Who knows what he will choose to do or not do? The reality is not our concern. But these blessings from the late good Sir Reglius make our job much simpler. They discussed how they would represent themselves to the Sylvanar into the evening. Scotty ate continuously, but not nearly as much as Shurus and Bast. When the sun had begun to rise in the hills, its light reddening through the crystal walls of the tavern, Shurus and Bast left to their rooms at the palace, granted to them diplomatically in lieu of the actual immediate audience with the Sylvanar. Scotty went to his room. He thought about staying up a little longer, to ruminate over Shurus' plans and see what might be the flaw in them. But upon touching the cool, soft bed, he immediately fell asleep. The next afternoon, Scotty awoke, feeling himself again, in other words, timid. For several weeks now, he had been a creature bent on mere survival. He had been driven to exhaustion, attacked by several jungle beasts, starved, nearly drowned, and forced into discussions of ancient Almeri poetical works. The discussion he had with Shurus and Bast about how to dupe the Sylvanar into signing their contracts seemed perfectly reasonable then. Scotty dressed himself in his old battered clothes and went downstairs in search of food and a peaceful place to think. "You're up," cried Bast upon seeing him. "We should go to the palace now." "Now?" whined Scotty. "Look at me, I need new clothes. This isn't the way one should dress to pay a call on a prostitute, let alone the voice of the people of Valenwood. I haven't even bathed." "You must cease from this moment forward being a clerk and become a student of mercantile trade," said Leolus Shurus grandly, taking Scotty by the arm and leading him into the sunlit boulevard outside. "The first rule is to recognize what you represent to the prospective client and what angle best suits you. You cannot dazzle him with opulent fashion and professional bearing, my dear boy, and it will be fatal if you attempt to. Trust me on this. Several others besides Bast and I are guests at the palace, and they have made the error of appearing too eager, too formal, too ready for business. They will never be granted audience with the Sylvanar, but we have remained aloof ever since the initial rejection. I have dallied about the court, spread my knowledge in life in the imperial city, had my ears pierced, attended promenades, eaten and drunk of all that was given to me. I dare say I have put on a pound or two. The message we have sent is clear. It is in his, not our, best interest to meet." "Our plan worked," added Bast. "When I told his minister that our imperial representative had arrived and that we were at last willing to meet with the Sylvanar this morning, we were told to bring you there straight away." "Aren't we late then?" asked Scotty. "Very," laughed Shurus. "But that's again part of the angle we represented, benevolent disinterest. Remember not to confuse the Sylvanar with conventional nobility. His is the mind of the common people. When you grasp that, you will understand how to manipulate him." Shurus spent the last several minutes of the walk through the city expounding on his theories about what Valenwood needed. How much and at what price? They were staggering figures, far more construction and far higher cost than anything Scotty had been used to dealing with. He listened carefully. All around them, the city of Sylvanar revealed itself. Glass and flower, roaring winds, and beautiful inertia. When they reached the palace of the Sylvanar, the Cumus Scotty stopped stunned. Shurus looked at him for a moment and then laughed. It's quite bizarre, isn't it? That it was, a frozen scarlet burst of twisted uneven spires as if a rival sun rising, a blossom of the size of a village, where couriers and servants resembled nothing so much as the insects walked about it sucking its ichor. Entering over a bent petal-like bridge, the three walked through the palace of unbalanced walls, where the partitions bent close together and touched. There was a shaded hall or a small chamber, where they rubbed away from one another. There was a courtyard. There were no doors anywhere. No any way to get to the Sylvanar but by crossing through the entire spiral of the palace. Through meetings at bedrooms and dining halls, past dignitaries, concerts, musicians, and many guards. It's an interesting place, said Bast, but not very much privacy. Of course that suits the Sylvanar well. When they reached the inner corridors, 2 hours after they first entered the palace, guards brandishing blades and bows stopped them. We have an audience with the Sylvanar, said Shurus patiently. This is Lord Decumus Scotti, the Imperial representative. One of the guards disappeared down the winding corridor and returned moments later with a tall, proud, postmark-clad, in loose robe of patchwork leather. He was the Minister of Trade. The Sylvanar which wishes to speak with Lord Scotti alone. It was not the place to argue or show fear, so Scotti stepped forward, not even looking towards Shurus and Bast. He was certain they were showing their masks of benevolent indifference. Following the minister into the audience chamber, Scotti recited to himself all the facts and figures Shurus had presented to him. He willed himself to remember the angle and the image he must project. The audience chamber of the Sylvanar was an enormous dome, where the walls bent from bowl-shaped at the base inward to almost meet at the top. A thin ray of sunlight streamed through the fissure hundreds of feet above, and directly upon the Sylvanar, who stood upon a puff of shimmering grey powder. For all the wonder of the city and the palace, the Sylvanar himself looked perfectly ordinary, an average blandly handsome, slightly tired-looking, extraordinary wood elf, of the type one might see in any capital in the Empire. It was only when he stepped from the dais that Scotti noticed an eccentricity in his appearance. He was very short. I had to speak with you alone, said the Sylvanar, in voice common and unrefined. May I see your papers? Scotti handed him the blank contracts from Lord Bannock's building commission. The Sylvanar studied them, running his finger over the embossed seal of the Emperor, before handing them back. He suddenly seemed shy, looking to the floor. There are many charlatans at my court who wish to benefit from the wars. I thought you and your colleagues were among them, but those contracts are genuine. Yes, they are, said Scotti, calmly. The Sylvanar's conventional aspect made it easy for Scotti to speak, with no formal greetings, no deference, exactly as Shurus had instructed. It seems most sensible to begin straight away talking about the roads which need to be rebuilt, then the harbors that the Almeri have destroyed, and then I can give you my estimates on the costs of resupplying and renovating the trade routes. Why hasn't the Emperor seen fit to send a representative when the war with Elsewhere began 2 years ago? Asked the Sylvanar glumly. Scotti thought for a moment before replying of all the common boss Mary he had met in Ballenwood, the greedy, frightened mercenaries who had escorted him from the border, the hard-drinking revelers and expert pest exterminating archers in the western cross of Valinesti, nosy old Mother Pascost in Havel Slump, Captain Balfix, the poor sadly reformed pirate, the terrified but hopeful refugees of Athay and Granos, the mad murderous, self-devouring well hunt of Vindisi, the silent, dour boatman hired by Grief Malone, the degenerate Grayspin Bast. If one creature represented their total disposition, and that of many more throughout the province, what would be his personality? Scotti was a clerk by occupation and nature, Instinctively comfortable, cataloging and filing, making things fit in a system. If the soul of Valenwood were to be filed, where would it be put? The answer came upon him almost before he posed himself the question. Denial. I am afraid that question doesn't interest me, said Scotty. Now, can we get back to the business at hand? All afternoon, Scotty and the Sylvanar discussed the pressing needs of Valenwood. Every contract was filled and signed. So much was required that there were so many costs associated that addendums and codicils had to be scribbled into the margins of the papers, and those had to be re-signed. Scotty maintained his benevolent indifference, but he found that dealing with the Sylvanar was not quite the same as dealing with a simple, sullen child. The voice of the people knew certain practical, everyday things very well. The yields of the fish, the benefits of trade, the condition of every township, the forest in his province. We will have a banquet tomorrow night to celebrate this commission, said the Sylvanar at last. Best make it tonight, replied Scotty. We should leave for Cyrodiil with the contracts tomorrow, so I'll need a safe passage to the border. We best not waste any more time. Agreed, said the Sylvanar, and called for his Minister of Trade to put his seal on the contracts and arrange for the feast. Scotty left the chamber and was greeted by Bast and Juras. Their faces showed the strain of maintaining the illusion of unconcern for too many hours. As soon as they went out of sight of the guards, they begged Scotty to tell them all. When he showed them the contract, Bast began weeping with delight. Anything about the Sylvanar that surprised you? Asked Juras. I hadn't expected him to be half my height. Was he? Juras looked mildly surprised. He must have shrunk since I tried to have an audience with him earlier. Maybe there is something to all that nonsense about him being affected by the plight of his people. A Dancing Fire, Chapter 7, by Walking Yarth. Scene, Sylvanar, Valenwood, date, 13 Sun's Dusk, 3rd Era, 397. The banquet at the palace of the Sylvanar was well attended by every jealous bureaucrat and trader who had attempted to contract the rebuilding of Valenwood. They looked on Decimus Scotty, Leodes, Juras, and Bast with undisguised hatred. It made Scotty very uncomfortable, but Juras delighted in it. As the servants brought in platter after platter of roasted meats, Juras poured himself a cup of jaga and toasted the clerk. I can confess it now, said Juras. I had grave doubts about inviting you to join me on this adventure. All the other clerks and agents of the building commissions I contacted were more outwardly aggressive, but none of them made it through, let alone to the audience chamber of the Sylvanar, let alone broker the deals on their own like you did. Come, have a cup of jaga with me. No thank you, said Scotty. I had too much of that drug infalinesti and nearly got sucked dry by a giant tick because of it. I'll find something else to drink. Scotty wandered about the hall until he saw some diplomats drinking mugs of a steaming brown liquid, poured from a large silver urn. He asked them if it was tea. Tea made from leaves? Scoffed the first diplomat. Not in Valenwood. This is Rothmeth. Scotty poured himself a mug and took a tentative sip. It was gammy, bitter, and sugared, and very salty. At first it seemed very disagreeable to his palate, but a moment later he found he had drained the mug and was pouring another. His body tingled. All the sounds in the chamber seemed oddly disjointed, but not frighteningly so. So you're the fellow who got the Sylvanar to sing all those contracts, said the second diplomat. That must have required some deep negotiation. Not at all, just a little basic understanding of mercantile trading, grinned Scotty, pouring himself a third mug of Rothmeth. The Sylvanar was very eager to involve the Imperial State with the affairs of Valenwood. I was very eager to take a percentage of the commission. With all that blessed eagerness, it was merely a matter of putting quill to contract. Bless you. You have been in the employ of His Imperial Majesty very long? Asked the first diplomat. It's a bite, or rather, a bit more complicated than that in the Imperial City. Between you and me... Oh no. Between you and me, I don't really have a job. I used to work at Lord Atrius and his building commission. But I got sacked. Then the contracts are from Lord Vannex and his building commission. Because I got them from this fellow Reglius, who is a competitor but still a very fine fellow, until he was made dead by the Kashiti. Scotty drained his fifth mug. When I go back to the Imperial City, then the real negotiations can begin. Bless you. I can go to my old employer and to Lord Vanek and say, "Look here, you, which one of you wants these commissions?" And they will fall over each other to take them from me. It would be bidding war from my percentage of likes of which no one nowhere has ever seen. So you're not a representative of His Imperial Majesty the Emperor? Asked the first diplomat. Oh no. Didn't you hear what I said? You stupid? Scotty felt a surge of rage, which quickly subsided, chuckled and poured himself a seventh mug. The building commissions are privately owned, and they are still representatives of the Emperor. So I am a representative of the Emperor. Or I will be. When I get these contracts in, it's very complicated. I can understand why you're not following. Bless you. It's all like the poet said, a dancing fire. If you follow the illusion, that is to say, illusion. And your colleagues? Are they representatives of the Emperor? Asked the second diplomat. Scotty burst into laughter, shaking his head. The diplomats bade him their respects and went to talk to the minister. Scotty stumbled out of the palace and reeled through the strange organic avenues and boulevards of the city. It took him several hours to find his way to Birthala Hall and his room. Once there he slept, very nearly, on his bed. In the next morning, he woke to Shures and Bast in his room, shaking him. He felt half asleep and unable to open his eyes fully, but otherwise fine. The conversation with the diplomats floated in his mind in a haze, like an obscure childhood memory. "What in Mara's name is Rothmed?" he asked quickly. "Rancid, slowly fermented meat juices with lots of spices to kill the poisons," smiled Bast. "I should have warned you to stay with Jaga." "You must understand the meat mandate by now," laughed Shures. "This Bosmeri would rather eat each other than touch the fruit in the vine or their field." What did you say to those diplomats?" cried Scotty, panicking. "What did I say to those diplomats?" cried Scotty, panicking. "Nothing bad, apparently," said Shures, pulling out some papers. "Your escorts are downstairs to bring you to the Imperial Province. Here are your papers of safe passage. The Sylvanar seems very impatient about business proceedings forward rapidly. He promises to send you some sort of rare treasure when the contracts are fulfilled. See, he's already given me something." Shures showed off his new bejeweled earring, a beautiful large faceted ruby. Bast showed that he had a similar one. The two fat fellows left the room so Scotty could dress and pack. A full regiment of the Sylvanar Guard was on the street in front of the tavern. They surrounded a carriage crested with official arms of Valenwood. Still dazed, Scotty climbed in, and the captain of the guard gave the signal. They began a quick gallop. Scotty shook himself, and then peered behind. Bast and Shures were waving him goodbye. "Wait," Scotty cried, "aren't you coming back to the Imperial Province too?" "The Sylvanar asked that we stay behind as Imperial representatives," yelled Leodes Shures, "in case there's a need for more contracts and negotiations. He's appointed us Undrape, some sort of special honor for foreigners at court. Don't worry, lots of banquets to attend. You can handle the negotiations with Vanek and Adrius yourself, and we will keep things settled here." Shures continued to yell advice about business, but his voice became indistinct with distance. Soon it disappeared altogether as the convoy rounded the streets of Sylvanar. The jungle loomed suddenly, and then they were in it. Scotty had only gone through it by foot, or along the rivers by slow-moving boat. Now it flashed all around him in profusions of greens. The horses seemed even faster moving through the underbrush than on the smooth paths of the city. None of the weird sounds of dank smells of the jungle penetrated the escort. It felt to Scotty as if he were watching a play about a jungle with the background of a quickly moving scream, which offered only the merest suggestion of the place. So it went for 2 weeks. There was lots of food and water in the carriage with the clerk. so he merely ate and slept as the caravan pressed endlessly on. From time to time he would hear the sound of blades clashing, but when he looked around, whatever had attacked the caravan had long since been left behind. At last they reached the border, where an imperial garrison was stationed. Scotty presented the soldiers who met the carriage with the papers. They asked him a barrage of questions that he answered monosyllabically, and then left him pass. It took several more days to arrive at the gates of the imperial city. The horses that had flown so fast through the jungle now slowed down to in the unfamiliar territory of the wooded Colobian estates. By contrast, the cries of his province bird and smells of his province plant life brought Decamus Scotty alive. It was as if he had been dreaming all the past month. At the gates of the city, Scotty's carriage door was opened for him and he stepped out on uncertain legs. Before he had a moment to say something to the escort, they had vanished, galloping back south throughout the forest. The first thing he did now that he was home was to go to the closest tavern and have tea and fruit and bread. He never ate meat again. He told himself that would suit him very nicely. Negotiations with Lord Atreus and Lord Bannock proceeded immediately thereafter. It was most agreeable. Both commissions recognized how lucrative the rebuilding of Valenwood would be for their agency. Lord Bannock claimed, quite justifiably, that as the contracts had been written on forms notarized by his commission, he had the legal right to them. Lord Atreus claimed that the Scotty was his agent and representative, and that he had never been released from employment. The Emperor was called to arbitrate, but he claimed to be unavailable. His advisor, the Imperial battle mage Shagar Tharn, had disappeared long ago and could not be called on for his wisdom and impartial meditation. Scotty lived very comfortably off the bribes from Lord Atreus and Lord Bannock. Every week, a letter would arrive from Jurist or Bast asking about the status of negotiations. Gradually, these letters ceased coming, and more urgent ones came from the Minister of Trade and the Silvenar himself. The War of the Blue Divide with Somerset Isle ended with Altmeri winning several new coastal islands from the Wood Elves. The war with Elsewhere continued, ravaging the eastern borders of Valenwood. Still, Bannock and Atreus fought over who would help. One fine morning in the early spring of the year 3rd Era 398, a courier arrived at the Scotty's door. Lord Bannock has won the Valenwood Commission and requests that you and the contracts come to his hall at your earliest convenience. Has Lord Atreus decided not to challenge further? Asked Scotty. He's been unable to, having died very suddenly just now from a terribly unfortunate accident, said the courier. Scotty had wondered how long it would be before the Dark Brotherhood was brought in for a final negotiations. As he walked towards Lord Bannock's building commission, a long, severe piece of architecture on a minor but respectable plaza, he wondered if he had played the game as he ought to have. Could Bannock be also rapacious as to offer him a lower percentage of the commission now that his chief competitor was dead? Thankfully, he discovered Lord Bannock had already decided to pay Scotty what he had proposed during the heat of the winter negotiations. His advisors had explained to him that other lesser building commissions might come forward unless the matter were handled quickly and fairly. Glad we had all the legal issues down with, said Lord Bannock fondly. Now we can get to the business of helping the poor boss Mary and collecting the profits. It's a pity you weren't our representative for all the troubles with Bendermac and the Arnesian business. But there will be plenty more wars, I'm sure of that. Scotty and Lord Bannock sent word to the Silvenar that at last they were prepared to honor the contracts. A few weeks later, they held a banquet in honor of the profitable enterprise. Decamus Scotty was the darling of the Imperial City, and no expense was spared to make it an unforgettable evening. As Scotty met the nobles and wealthy merchants who would be benefiting from his business dealings, an exotic but somehow faintly familiar smell rose in the ballroom. He traced it to its source, a thick roasted slab of meat, so long and thick it covered several platters. The Cyrodiilic revelers were eating it ravenously, unable to find the words to express their delight at its taste and texture. It's like nothing I ever had before. It's like pit-fed venison. Do you see the marbling of fat and meat? It's a masterpiece. Scotty went to take a slice, but then he saw something embedded deep in the dried and rendered roast. He nearly collided with his new employer, Lord Bannock, as he stumbled back. "Where did this come from?" Scotty stammered. "From our client, the Sylvanar," beamed his lordship. "It's some kind of local delicacy they call unthrapa." Scotty vomited and didn't stop for some time. It cast rather a temporary pall on the evening, but when Declan Scotty was carried off to his manor house, the guests continued to dine. Wait, the unthrapa was delightful, even more so when Lord Bannock himself took a slice and found the first of 2 rubies buried within. How very clever of the Bosmer to invent such a dish, the Cyrodiils agreed.